ago was that done? 5, 6, 7?
2005.
2005. So 4 years old. So today he'll bring you up to date and much more. This is Brunetti from Pennsylvania. I'm not going to get into a lot of introduction. By the end of the day, you'll know him well. He's a ubiquitous speaker at Acres USA conference, which I've been attending for many years. And that's where I got to know him, as well as at my brother's farm at some events there years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And we've wanted to have him in for a long time. He's a hard speaker to get, so we're very fortunate to have him. I'm not going to do all these credentials and everything. I think you'll see by the end of the day he's well credentialed and has a lot of, Jerry is an in-depth researcher in all kinds of topics that affect health, farming. For example, how many of you have heard of A1, A2 milk? Okay, about half. And he's going to give us some details, some insights, and most of all, I want to know your gut feelings about that.
Is that a pun?
Since it's not proven science and all that. Anyway, Jerry Brunetti, take it away.
Take it away. Can you hear me? Praise God. No? Mic's not on? Sound man, mic's not on? It's up here. Better? Can you hear me anyway?
Yes.
I don't need a mic. Well, it's good to be back in northern Florida. The last time I was down here, I think it was back in the 90s, I was visiting Phil Callahan, who was living in Gainesville. Anybody know who Phil Callahan is? Yeah. And Phil was living in Gainesville at the time, and I ended up going off to that cute little island just west of Gainesville in the Gulf.
Cedar Key. Cedar Key.
Cedar Key. Yeah, little fishing island? Yes. Yeah. So Phil was working on some research. He was given a grant by 3 Diamond tuna people as to how to prevent them from unnecessarily killing dolphins. And he was working with all this contraptions. Phil was an electronics wizard. Actually developed a very sound theory as to why we didn't need DDT back in the 60s. Because he said that insects communicated with sick plants in the infrared spectrum and that they could pick up where unhealthy plants were based on the emissions that came out of the plant tissue. A lot of it was ammonia emissions, which traveled in the infrared spectrum and communicated with the antenna of these insects, which were the pests that were attracted to the sick plants, and said he could jam the communication frequencies just by using electronics. Of course, he was scoffed at because it didn't make any money for anybody when you're using DDT. So he was way ahead of the curve, and at that time he was trying to work with a radio frequency research project because he claimed that he found out that dolphins communicated with one another with the pineal gland in the brain using radio wave frequencies to discover or to communicate what they did discover to other dolphins. So that was as far as I knew he got, and then after that Phil got into a car accident and then started having some dementia problems. So right now he's still alive, but pretty much cloistered and sequestered somewhere in Arizona. And that was the last time I was down here in northern Florida. So I'm really a cracker from Pennsylvania after all. So, but it is good to be in front of you folks, and I hope that you get the understanding that I'm a big picture kind of person. I'm going to talk about soils. I'm going to talk about human health. I'm going to talk about economics, because I think if it's an all-day affair, I think we need to get a perspective in terms of where we're at. We're, as Dickens said back in the 18th century, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's a very precarious time in history. I've been in this line of work for about 30 years. 1979 is when we founded Agri-Dynamics, which was a consultancy for biological farming. Back in the day, there was no organic certification. And I've seen a lot of things come and go, and fortunately, a lot of the better things stayed. The Acres Conference is a real legacy in that whole time period. About 35 years now, the Acres Conference has been going on. And since that time, now we're seeing comparable conferences of size and quality appear like dandelion blossoms all over the United States. You have the Vermont Conference, you have the Mothka, Maine Conference, I'm on the board of directors for PASA, which is the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Conference. We have our annual conference in February, and we get 2,000 people at that. The Upper Midwest Conference gets about 2,500 people. I know you have the SOG Conference in Tennessee, Carolina, Kentucky, Texas Organics, the West Coast. I mean, it's exploding, which is really good news because I think what we're starting to realize is that maybe we haven't hit critical mass yet from my perspective, but when I look back to 1979, I was a delegate at the Northeast Agricultural Leadership Assembly because at the time, before I formed my own consultancy, I worked for a farmers cooperative called the National Farmers Organization. I was a delegate to a conference from Maine to Delaware, 10 states, to figure out how are we going to save Northeast agriculture, how are we going to become more food self-sufficient in light of the fact that we're importing up to 80% of the foods we eat in the Northeast from other states. And that was in 1979. So all I can say is, what was going on then, which was virtually and comparatively nothing, and what I'm seeing going on today, I can only say I think we're kind of on an upright spike because what I always emphasize to people is that the good news is the bad news, right? The bad news primarily in our culture, in our society, is really compromised health. And when you look at 40% incidences of cancer now being a documented statistic in the United States, 40% cancers, almost 1 out of 2 of us are going to meet cancer, which means everybody's going to be affected by just that one illness. And when you look at diabetes, it's worse. All right, so I'm going to cover a lot of the stuff just to make an emphasis that if you're an eater, you're involved in agriculture. If you're a producer, you're directly involved in agriculture. Economically speaking, I think that the best hope that we have resurrecting the economic malaise and this so-called recession, depression in the United States is we need about 5 to 10 million more farmers in the United States. That's what we need. And if we get about 5 to 10 million more farmers in the United States, of the persuasion that you have here in Live Oak, that's the kind of farmers I'm talking about, not the 3,000-acre farms. That's fine that they're here. I work with some big farms like that. So it's not anti-large. It has nothing to do with size, but what we do need is a very local food system that can create not just healthy foods that people need in order not to get these chronic, expensive illnesses. There's a healthcare crisis, like Walter Cronkite said not too long ago. The healthcare system in the United States is neither healthy, caring, or a system. Right? We don't have a healthcare system. We have a disease management system based on patented drugs, which are incredibly expensive and remote with side effects. That is an agricultural issue. The healthcare issue is an agricultural issue. So I'm going to zip through a bunch of stuff. Stop me anytime you want with a comment or a question because I talk fast. I'm from Pennsylvania, after all. And let's see if this thing works. So if you take a look at where we're at in the world, we're not very far along. I mean, we are like beneath some Eastern European countries in terms of statistics. The life expectancy and infant mortality, women's life expectancy, it doesn't look good. And we spend more per capita on health care, I'll put that in quotes, than any other country in the world. We're up to now a huge percentage of our gross domestic product is for managing these lousy statistics. Now, this is a very telling statistic. In 1960 versus 2007, the gross domestic product, 5%, food cost, 18%. It's just about flipped, almost. More and more of our disposable income now is going for health care and less for food, if you want to call what we're eating as food, food. And I think there's a direct correlation that when you look at from 1900 to 2007, the risk of cancer, you can see it exponentially. There is an interesting proclamation that cancer is more prevalent today because we have an older population. Really. I'll show you some statistics that'll rebuff those proclamations. By the way, we don't really have an older population. We have a lot more of the population that's old. And what that means is average life expectancy. What's that mean, average life expectancy? That means if you have 1 foot in hot water and 1 foot on dry ice, you're lukewarm. You're comfortable, right? If you take out the children deaths in the